I hope you're well. Welcome or welcome back to my channel, and welcome to today's video, which is my Q3 or autumnal unhaul. So if you're new to my channel, first, hello, welcome, but essentially several years ago I adopted the capsule wardrobe for my closet, and earlier this year I decided to apply similar practices for my books. So essentially every season I go through my bookcase and I get rid of books that I read and didn't enjoy, books that I read and enjoyed but probably won't reread, books that have just been collecting dust because my taste might have changed, stuff like that. So we're gonna go through my very healthy stack of books that I'm unhauling because basically I needed to. I had stacks of books everywhere that I had bought in recent book hauls, like when I went into New York City. I have that vlog for you in the cards, and just because I accumulate books because I'm a bookworm and a reader, so I needed to do a little bit of a fall cleanup. So just as an FYI before I dive into it, I do not throw out books. I'll let my family pick through them, see if there's anything they're interested in, and then I donate the books to a local bookstore where all the proceeds actually go towards supporting the public library in my town. So why don't we dive right in? So as I mentioned, I do have a pretty healthy stack of books that I am going to be donating. So we're just going to dive into it. It's a selection of fiction and nonfiction in no particular order, so we're just gonna go for it. You know how this works. But the first book is The Incredible Nellie Bly by Luciana Simonino, and this is a graphic biography, so it is a graphic novel-esque biography on the journalist Nellie Bly. I read this not that long ago. I want to say I might have read it in August, and I enjoyed it, but it wasn't necessarily my favorite graphic biography that I have. I did feel that it was more of like a dumbed down version of her life, whereas the graphic biographies that I've really enjoyed, one on Hannah Arendt in particular, was pretty thorough, and it went into more detail and made it easier to kind of look into aspects of her life, whereas this felt like it might have been directed at a slightly younger audience than that Hannah Arendt one, which I adored. So while I did enjoy the reading of it, and Nellie Bly is phenomenal, I mean, this is the journalist who had herself institutionalized at an insane asylum so that she could do an expose on it. She traveled around the world, which is something that I didn't know about her before reading this, so the book did have merit. It just wasn't something that I see myself picking up again, so I want to pass it on to someone who will enjoy it. And then the next book we have is More Miracle Than Bird by Alice Miller, and this is a World War I historical fiction. It is about the poet Yeats and his wife Georgie. It's kind of about their relationship, both before they're married and then a little bit about after they're married, if I remember rightly, and it's set in World War I London, which I found really interesting. It also has this sort of occult or secret society vibe going for it, and I do remember really enjoying it, but I read it last year. I want to say maybe last spring or early summer, something like that, kind of at the height of the pandemic, as far as we knew it at the time, and I just don't necessarily see myself rereading this. I think I gave it 4 stars at the time, so I did enjoy it, but as I said, it's not something that I've really been drawn to or that I see myself reading. But let me tell you, I really did enjoy the fact that this book was classified as occult fiction, because apart from this kind of cloak and dagger-y secret society and like a psychic / medium type person, there really wasn't a ton of occultish things about it. Like, it didn't get dark occult, if that makes any sense. Brittany, use your words. So yeah, that's my sentiment on that. Then we have a non-fiction title that I definitely had to do a little bit of soul searching because I really enjoyed the subject matter here. And it's The Zarinas' Lost Treasure by Gerald Easter and Mara Voorhey. And this is nonfiction about Catherine the Great, who everyone knows at this point is a historical girl crush of mine, like severe. Probably like top shelf, the number one at the moment, if I had to pick from my laundry list of historical girl crushes. And I was really, really drawn to this because of a number of things. It is about a shipwreck, it is about art history, it is about Catherine the Great and Russia, so really, you couldn't go wrong for me on any of those levels. But essentially, this is a book about how Catherine the Great was trying to acquire all of these masterpieces from Europe and kind of competing with the other royal families or reigning monarchs at the time to buy up as many of these masters' works as possible. She ends up buying and purchasing these Dutch masterpieces, and on the journey from Europe into Russia, the ship is wrecked and everything is lost, and so present day someone is trying to locate the shipwreck and see if the artwork is still there. And it's really interesting if you're someone who is into any of those things that I mentioned: shipwrecks, buried treasure, Russia, Catherine the Great, art, history. Like, it's really enjoyable. I want to say I gave this 4 stars, maybe a 3.5 at the time. I do remember that there were some male gazy aspects on a couple of pages or paragraphs that I wasn't particularly drawn to, but overall it was really interesting and something that I had not heard about previously. So if you're in the market for nonfiction, maybe this is for you. But like all of the other books I just talked about, I've read it, don't see myself picking it up again. If I really want my Catherine the Great fix, probably just gonna pick up the Catherine the Great biography and reread it, because that was A+++, like 5-star times a million. I had such an amazing time with it. So Catherine the Great, that's kind of the book I would go to much sooner than this one. The next book is fiction, and it is Let's Get Back to the Party by Zach Salee, which is a book that I actually read during Pride Month for my work's book club. And this is one of these books that I just don't think I was necessarily the right reader for it. I thought it was really interesting, but I don't read a ton of contemporary fiction, and this definitely was that. So it was something that probably, if I hadn't had to read it for the book club, I wouldn't have been drawn to on my own. But it is a really interesting LGBTQ plus story that made me think. Like, that was one of the things that everyone in our book club kind of came out of this feeling. And also, it's set in the backdrop of the legalization of same-sex marriages by the Supreme Court, and also the mass shooting in the Orlando nightclub, which, just as an FYI, in case anyone is interested, it doesn't go into details about either, but it is sort of this specter that informs large chunks of the book. So just bear that in mind. But like I said, I'm not a huge contemporary fiction reader, so I really don't see myself picking this up once again. I always feel good when the majority of the books in these unhauls are books that I have read. And the next one is one that I've read recently as well, and that is Lamplighters by Emma Stone, or Emma Stone X. I'm not entirely sure which pronunciation is the correct one, but this is a book that is based on this mystery that happened, I want to say, either in the early 20th century or the very late 19th century, where basically these lighthouse keepers on this like remote lighthouse post just vanish without a trace. And like the clocks have stopped at one time, and like just all these weird circumstances that no one can really understand. The BuzzFeed Unsolved guys covered it, and it was the first time I heard about it. When I heard this book was based on it, I was like, this is cool. I could get into that. I, however, think I want to stick with the original Unsolved story rather than this one. I just didn't necessarily like the characters all that much, or where the book ended up going, how this mystery was developed into this work of fiction. So it just wasn't for me. I think it leaned a little bit more into the mystery elements than the historical stuff. There were kind of two timelines that we were dealing with, both the men on the lighthouse and then their wives or the significant others like 20 or 25 years later, and it just wasn't for me. I think I gave it 3 stars when I read it, so it wasn't awful, but it wasn't exactly what I expected. I was far more interested in the storyline when we were in the past with the men than I was with their wives. Their wives I didn't find particularly likable and wasn't really invested in their story. So you win some, you lose some. But this will hopefully find a good home. The next book is one that I haven't read yet. It is The Librarian of Auschwitz by Antonia Urturbe, and it's translated fiction. And I've decided, or I've noticed rather, that I am being a lot more discerning when it comes to World War II fiction. I'm really trying to read fiction that feels different, or like it's a story that I haven't heard before, whether it's a POV or a different part of the world, or I don't know, just something different. And this is one of these books that I picked up, and I was definitely drawn to it because it is based on a true story. It's about this this victim of the Holocaust, Dita, who I believe she's like a teenage girl in Auschwitz, and she is entrusted to protect this selection of books. And it is an interesting story. I would personally really like to read non-fiction on this young woman, Dita, because she sounds incredibly brave and incredibly inspiring, having lived through this experience. But I'm not necessarily drawn to it as fiction because I do feel like there are several other YA titles dealing with similar subjects and subject matter. So I'm going to give this one a new home. I also just don't happen to be much of a YA reader, which I think when I picked this up, I didn't necessarily realize that about it at the time. So that was kind of another strike against it. But as I said, if there is nonfiction on Dita out there, then I would 110% want to read that, because World War II is a time period that I am particularly fascinated with, both fiction and nonfiction. But I'm just branching out with that and trying to be a little bit more selective with the books that I read on the subject. So, very long-winded explanation. And then we have another nonfiction title, How You Say It by Catherine D. Kinsler, which is another book that I read for the Work Book Club, and it's all about the way we actually speak, the words we use, our accents, etc., all help us to feel like part of a group and also make us other to someone else. So it's an othering thing as well. And it was really interesting. There were a lot of topics that it touched upon when it came to accents and different languages, like speaking multiple languages. And if you're someone who's into linguistics, I think you would really enjoy this. But overall, for me, this was a little bit of a yawn fest. Like, I had to really push myself to read it. It was a little bit more sciencey, a little bit more statistic heavy than I typically go for, because I'm someone who reads a lot of nonfiction that's based on history. So this was really, really, really not in my wheelhouse. I did finish the book for the book club, but it was a bit of a slog, despite some of the interesting snippets and like factoids that I got from this that would be great if you're like at a cocktail party and need like to just pull out random facts, as one does. But do I see myself reading it again? No. So this is gonna move on. Someone else. Another nonfiction title that I read, and it was okay. It didn't blow me away. The War Queens by Jonathan W. Jordan and Emily Ann Jordan, which it's basically this collection of mini biographies on, I want to say it's like 13 War Queens, which I thought 13 was a very random number, and it's supposed to cover a large swath of time. So you have some of these War Queens from like ancient times going up to like more contemporary times, with someone like Margaret Thatcher, who isn't a real queen, but kind of fits the definition of these women who were leading like military strategy and campaign and the like. Again, this was a bit of a slog. It was not a book that I was like particularly super invested in at the time. Like, it was something that I felt almost a little bit like a homework assignment, where I had to like sit down and be like, okay, Brittany, you're gonna read about one woman. Like, you're gonna do it. You're gonna finish this one section. It wasn't exactly what I had hoped for, and I do have other books on similar sort of themes that I think I might enjoy a little bit more, and I would sooner grab one of them than pick this up again. I also didn't feel that necessarily the women that they talked about were particularly diverse, and a significant number of them were women that I already knew about, and so I would have really liked to have had some more obscure women in the works. Also, the number 13 is just random. Like, do 10, do 15, even 20, but 13? That was just a weird quibble of mine, and would be a whole other tangent. But yeah, that's what we're going with here. So, wasn't a win for me. And the last book in column 1, I have 2 more columns to go, guys. I told you it's a big one. I feel like this book might get me canceled. Don't cancel me. I've talked about it numerous times on this channel as a book that I have yet to read, and as a historical fiction reader, I feel like people are gonna judge me. But I'm finally gonna get rid of The Nightingale by Christian Hannah, and it is a signed copy that I got from Barnes & Noble's when it first came out. I know that this is a book that people love. It is a World War II historical fiction, and again, like I said, I'm trying to be more discerning here. I don't necessarily feel that this story is all that original. I feel like I've seen bits and pieces of it in other books that I have read about the time period, and it has literally been sitting on my shelf since I picked it up that like Black Friday, right after this book came out, which is a number of years ago now. When is it? 2015. So I've had this book for 6 years and have really never even contemplated really reading it. Like, I haven't put it on a TBR. I haven't really thought about it all that much, except when I've been making videos about books I haven't read yet. So we're gonna say goodbye to this. I do still have another Christian Hannah book on my shelf, I think it's called The Winter Palace, which I believe is set in Russia. So that one I'm going to hang on to a little bit longer because Russia definitely has a little bit more of appeal to me, has a little bit more of an appeal to me than this one does currently. So hopefully someone else will get this copy and really, really enjoy it because, as I said, I do know that this is a book that a lot of people really, really love. Alright, moving on to column or tower number 2. The first book, which I realize I need to take flags out of before I donate it, is Split Tooth by Tanya Tagaq, which is this wonderful and trippy memoir about this Inuit woman living in the Arctic in the 1970s. It's about her growing up, kind of a coming of age story, and it's not a straightforward memoir. There are illustrations, there are poems or lyrics in the book itself, and then there are the more traditional sort of prose. Some of it felt a little bit like a fever dream. Some of it is very violent sounding. There is abuse talked about, and it's quite a book. I did enjoy it, but I don't see myself gravitating towards it again because it is weird. It is one of those books you just have to experience for yourself, because I do feel like some people will love it. I really enjoyed it, but other people are going to be like, what the actual fuck did I just read? And so that's kind of the impression this book leaves. It is not long at all. It is under 200 pages, so it is a fairly quick read, especially because it does have poems in it and illustrations. If you're looking to diversify your reading, I do think that this is a great book if you're looking for something by an Indigenous author. The next book is more nonfiction. It is Hitler's Fury by Wendy Lower, and I read this years and years and years ago, and it is a book that I still think about from time to time because it was so unsettling in a way. So it's about women living during World War II. They are Germans, they are Nazis, and it's basically trying to debunk this idea that the women were just like comforting the men or kind of living these quiet, unassuming lives during the war, by really looking at some of the more sinister examples of what women were doing during World War II and their involvement in the Holocaust. Like, it's looking at women who worked in the camps, it's looking at women who were like going on shopping sprees and romantic jaunts through the ghettos. Like, there's something about it. On the back of the book it talks about disquieting, and that is definitely it. It's one of these books that it kind of makes you wonder how humans can be so inhumane. And it's not a long book at all. You can't say you enjoy this book because it felt heavy at the time, but it was also really fascinating in the way that the human impulse to be drawn to the macabre and morbid is. Many of us can't look away from a train wreck or a car crash. It feels similar in that way, and it really just opened my eyes to a lot that I didn't know about in Germany at the time. And because I am someone who's drawn to these stories of women living during these historical periods, it really was up my alley. But as I said, I read it years and years and years ago and have not picked it up since, so I do think it's time to let this one go. Next, we have Black Tutors by Miranda Kaufmann, which has been on my TBR for a while. It's actually one of the books that is in my 5-star prediction videos. I remember seeing it on Emma at a Cup of Books like channel, maybe sometime last year, maybe the year before. I can't quite remember, but basically when she talked about it, I instantly put it in my cart and was just really fascinated by it. And then I think the same thing happened with Katie from over at Katie Reads and Rants, because she got the book as well and she read it and wasn't entirely impressed by it. And so I take Katie's opinions on books very seriously, and so basically this book has just kept moving further and further down my TBR list because of that. I do think the subject matter is interesting. It's looking at this like common assumption or misnomer that there weren't black people living in England during the Tudor time period, and is telling you the stories of some of those individuals, which I think is really interesting. But because I've heard kind of mixed things about it, it's no longer a 5-star prediction for me, and ultimately I just don't see myself picking it up anytime soon. So it's gotta go. So I'm realizing there are quite a number of books in these stacks that are books that I read for my work book club, and that's totally fine. I know my tastes pretty well at this point, and so the book club has definitely kind of made me go out of my comfort zone, sometimes with more success than others. This was actually a book that I thought was interesting, and I'm glad that I read it, but I don't see myself picking it up again, even though I do think it's a book that requires a second read to like truly appreciate. And the book in question is Moonbath by Yannick Lahans, which is a Woman in Translation title. It is translated from French. The author, Yannick, is Haitian, and it is like this multi-generational story in Haiti, covering 80 to 100 years, and it's really about a family who's living in poverty and sort of the obstacles they face living as kind of the have-nots in this society, but also looking at the sort of political and civil unrest in Haiti over the course of these 80 to 100 years. And it's another book that is a bit like a fever dream. It is also another book that the language, the word choice, the descriptions are also very violent. It does have abuse in it. It does have violence in it in general. So it's not going to be a book for everyone, but I did learn a lot about Haitian history kind of just through reading this, and I thought that it was definitely a challenging read because it did require such an active participation in the actual text. There was a lot of the Creole, I believe that's what the language is called, for Haitians, that was part of the story that you had to refer to in a glossary. You needed to have or be interested enough to kind of find out what point in history we were talking about, and it was one of those books that's definitely not a breezy read, let's just put it that way. So I do think, as I said, it is a book you need to read for a second time. Do I see myself reading it for a second time though? No. Whew. We're cruising. Okay, then we have Francesca Wade's Square Haunting, which is this book about writers living in London during the interwar years. The writers that it covers are Virginia Woolf, H.D., Dorothy Sayers, who else? Why am I blanking on this? Eileen Power and Jane Harrison. I don't know why I was blanking on those last two, but it's basically using this, what is the word? this, Brittany, what is the word? Conceit. That's the word. It's using this conceit that these women, these authors, all lived in this particular square in London, Mecklenburg, over the course of the interwar years, and using that kind of as the lens, it's looking at their lives, which were pretty unorthodox considering the time period that they were living in. These were women that were college educated, that were making careers based on their writing, who lived alone in some cases, who had relationships with men and in some case women that weren't necessarily like traditional in that sense of the word. So it was interesting, but I think for me it would have benefited from me having a bit more knowledge or a vested interest in any one of the particular women. I have read bits and pieces of some of their writing over the years, but none of them is someone that I'm particularly drawn to or that I could honestly say I'm a huge fan of, because I haven't read enough of their works or even a full-length piece of their work to really be able to say that. So I think this is a book that, if you're interested in any of these women, would probably be more up your alley than it was mine. Still, I did give it, I think, 4 stars when I read it not that long ago. So next, we're talking about 2 trilogies that I've read, that I enjoyed, but I basically had to have a little bit of an intervention with myself, because yes, I do reread books, but I honestly don't see myself investing in rereading 3 books at any time in order to really explore an entire story. So because of that, I've decided to let these books go, because, like I said, rereading one book is a commitment. And there's always this case of like FOMO, where because I'm rereading a book, I'm not reading a new book. I'm not reading something that I've recently added to my TBR. I'm reading something because I want it to be like a comfort read. It's cozy to me. I really enjoyed it the first time. I want to explore it again. I have a whole video on books that I love to reread. But am I gonna read 3 volumes for a second time? No, I am not. So the first of these trilogies is the Josephine B Trilogy by Sandra Guland. The first book is The Many Lives and Secret Sorrow of Josephine B, which is by far my favorite of the books in the trilogy, followed by Tales of Passion, Tales of Woe, and lastly, The Last Dance on Earth. Yes, that's the title. Brittany, you can read, I assure you. But essentially these books are all about the life of Josephine Bonaparte. They are written in the form of her letters and her diary entries, basically starting from when she lived on an island in the Caribbean, and her move to Paris, where she marries and has this unhappy marriage. She is nearly a victim of the Reign of Terror during the French Revolution and eventually meets Napoleon Bonaparte. And it's a story largely for the, I want to say definitely the last 2 volumes, but maybe a teeny tiny bit in the first one, about their life, their relationship, their marriage, and the sad sort of ending that comes to this epic romance throughout history. But as much as I enjoyed it, and I did, book 1 was by far my favorite, and I devoured it. Like, let's be real, I inhaled this. I finished the first book and had already ordered the second and third. Like, I really, really, really enjoyed it. If you're someone who's into French history, if you're interested in the French Revolution or the Napoleonic Wars, I do think that this would really be intriguing to you. But yeah, it's 3 books. I don't see myself rereading all 3 books at any time. So, unfortunately, these are gonna go. And then the other trilogy is one that I have such fond memories of reading, but it has been at least 15 years. Like, I read these books when I was still in high school, and I really enjoyed them. They have survived near drowning somehow. I do remember that. I was very upset that some of the pages got a little wet. And it's a set of books that I see all the time, and I tell myself I should reread it, and I never do. And this is the Guivere Trilogy by Rosalind Miles. And the first book is Guivere, Queen of the Summer Country, then it's The Knight of the Sacred Lake, and then lastly, The Child of the Holy Grail, and it is Arthurian legend. So if you really enjoy Arthurian legend, check these out. I really enjoyed them. I think these were probably the first, like, adult books that I have a vivid recollection of having read. Like, these had sex scenes in them, and I don't really remember reading books with that in it because I was reading classic novels at the time, and those tend to be more fade to black, especially the stuff I was reading, so that was like titillating at the time. But it's been 15, 16, maybe even 17 years since I read these books, and since I've never picked them up again, they're gonna go. But it was a fun time. Like, I will always have the memories of reading this series. The final column, the final tower of books. We're here. We're gonna do it. We're almost there, guys. So the first book is Bel Canto by Ann Patchett, which is again a book that I read really recently. I bought the book because I watched a movie adaptation of it with Julianne Moore at the beginning of the year. Ugly sobbed my way through it, really enjoyed it, ended up buying the DVD and the book, and was just gonna like have a fangirl moment. And so I bought the book, I read the book, and this is one of these rare, like, unicorn moments where I preferred the movie to the book. And that's not to say that this wasn't well written, it definitely was, but I would say that this is more literary than I anticipated because I hadn't read any other Ann Patchett books at the time. It felt a little dense to me on occasion, and it ended up not making me cry. It also is one of those books that has an epilogue that you wish you could unread after you've read it because it just ruins things. But essentially, this is a book that is set in an unnamed South American country. There is this birthday celebration being held for this wealthy Japanese businessman by the country's, like, political figures, and this famous soprano is brought in to perform. And during her performance and this party, these guerrillas take the entire party hostage. And the majority of the book is during this hostage situation, which actually covers several months, which I don't know if any government would let that happen. I don't know if that's realistic, but it is essentially the story of the relationships that form among the hostages with one another, and there is a romance in here, and there is also these relationships, these bonds that form between the hostages and the hostage takers. So it was interesting. Do I see myself picking it up again? No. And I realize I sound like a broken record, so I'll try not to say that anymore in this video. Next up, I just have to, before I go any further, sincerely apologize to my friend Liz, because I know this is a book that you picked for me. I haven't read it, and honestly, I don't see myself reading it, because I know, have a hard copy version of this book that I had picked up because Liz had recommended it to me years and years ago, and I unhauled it at some point. And then I asked her to pick out a few books for me to read once again, and this was a book that she threw in to the mix, and it has been on multiple TBRs at this point. I did try listening to the audiobook, and I don't think I got further than like 3%, and I honestly just don't think it's a book for me. And that is The Power by Naomi Alderman. I know some people really love this book. I've also heard some mixed things about it, and I don't see myself reading it anytime soon, like ever, to be quite honest at this point. It is speculative fiction, which is not something I'm particularly drawn to, even though there is like a feminist bent to it. All I really know about it is that the women in this book all discover they have this power that is able to harm and to kill, and that's literally it. So, I don't know, the feminist thing sounds fascinating, but I don't know if I could get past the speculative element here. I do have another book by this author, Naomi Alderman, Disobedience, which I think is going to be more my taste than this one, so I'm going to keep that, and this is just going to go. And we have another contemporary fiction novel here, Bird Summons by Leila Abu Layla. Fun fact, my grandmother's name is Leila, so that was definitely an appealing name for an author. But this is a book that is about 3 Muslim women who go on kind of this pilgrimage to visit the gravesite of this British, well, I guess this Scottish woman who converted to Islam in the 19th century. So while on this journey, it's a bit of a journey of self-discovery as well. They all have aspects of the lives they now lead that they're unsatisfied with, and so it's kind of coming to some sort of understanding for themselves and with one another. It was really interesting until we got to like maybe the last third of the book. Then there was this like magical realism element that really made it get bizarre, and I was not a fan of it. I mean, it made sense because part of this book is essentially that there's this mythical bird that exists in kind of Celtic lore as well as in like the Muslim or Islamic tradition, and one of the individuals sees this bird. But basically until you get towards the last third of the book, it's her seeing it in dreams, and I'm like, okay, fine. But then things happen. Things got weird. I don't 100% think that I understand everything that happened during that part of the book, and it definitely made my ranking of the book, my score, my grade, whatever you want to call it, go down a little bit. But I did enjoy the first 2/3 of the book, so there is that. The next book is one of those that is World War II historical fiction that I'm getting rid of because I don't think the story is all that innovative or all that unique. And this one is In Another Time by Bel Canto, and it's a story that has 2 timelines. So one is sort of before the war, but during the time period in Germany when the Nazis were creating all of these discriminatory laws against Jewish citizens and really depriving them of citizenship and also depriving them of their humanity, or at least trying to. And then the second timeline is after the war in, I think, 1946. But the main storyline seems to be that there are these two young people who fall in love. One is Jewish and one is not. And so it's the story of him trying to help her escape. And then I think the second timeline is her reemerging after the war and not necessarily having memory or all of her memories. And while there are aspects of the story that do sound really interesting to me, again, I think there are books out there that I would probably enjoy a little bit more that are probably a little bit less cliche. I feel like that's a really harsh description of this book, considering I haven't read it, but we're gonna go with it. So, I feel like this video is basically a purge of the majority of my World War II historical fiction, because here is another World War II historical fiction, Everyone Brave is Forgiven by Chris Cleave, which I believe is actually based on like correspondences between his grandparents, if I remember rightly, but it is essentially a World War II love story set in London, and I feel like those are a dime a dozen. I know I've certainly read quite a number of them. Most of them are mediocre. I do have several that are near and dear to my heart at this point, so I would probably read those again rather than pick up a book that might be a hit or miss. Like, I don't want to read mediocre books. And this one is giving me mediocre vibes. So, if someone has read this and thinks it's a rave, definitely let me know. But for now, in the unhaul pile it goes. Next, we have another contemporary fiction, and it's called The Unbreakables by Lisa Barr. And it actually, I'm seeing it now, it has a blurb from Helen Huang, so I do feel like there must be some sort of romance element here, but it is about a middle-aged woman who ends up going to like St. Paul de Vence, is that the area? Yes, St. Paul de Vence in France, and kind of rediscovering herself. I'm getting sort of Eat, Pray, Lovey vibes here, where I think like she's either recently divorced or has discovered that her husband has cheated on her, something of that sort. Her daughter is abroad and she decides to go abroad too, and definitely getting Eat, Pray, Love romance vibes here, but that isn't my usual cup of tea. This book has been on my shelf for yonks, and I haven't so much as glanced at it. Brittany, words. So I'm just gonna say goodbye. Alright, and now we have a historical romance that I picked up because I was looking to fill a void that Evie Dunmore had left before her third book came out, and that is A Lady's Formula for Love by Elizabeth Everett. It is a Victorian historical romance. The women in the book are part of like this clandestine secret society of female scientists, and the love interest is this protection officer that is meant to prevent the leader of this group from getting assassinated, essentially. It is a book that had a like love at first sight sort of trope. It was cute, but not my favorite. It was lacking something. I don't know how to articulate it, but it just wasn't what the Evie Dunmore book was, or even the Amanda Collins stories that I've read recently. So, sayonara. Then we have Interior Chinatown by Charles Yu, and this was another work book club book. It is this satire on sort of Asian Americans in the entertainment industry. The main character wants to work his way up from like the roles of generic Chinese guy or generic Asian guy to like the kung fu guy, which is like the pinnacle of success for an Asian American in Hollywood. And it's written as a screenplay, and it's interesting. I see why so many people enjoyed it, but it didn't do something for me. There were parts of it though that were really interesting. I do really appreciate any book that has a social commentary, and this was like jam-packed with it. It made me think, and it was also a quick read because as I mentioned, it is written like a screenplay. So the format makes it a really quick read, but it just wasn't for me at the end of the day. And then we have a modern classic that I read recently, The End of the Affair by Graham Greene, which again, this was a situation where I saw movie adaptations of it. I think 2 of them. Actually, I think one of them is it with Julianne Moore? It might be. And then the other one is with Deborah Kerr, and it is set during World War II in London. It's about this kind of love affair gone wrong. The man who's in this relationship, or had been in this relationship, is reflecting back on the affair and really has some issues and some hatred for the woman that he once loved. It's very obsessive. It is very raw. It is definitely more on the literary side of things. And this was just a book that I think I preferred both movie adaptations to the actual book itself. So that's why it's going. Now we have another nonfiction title, which is Violins of Hope by James A. Grimes. And this was really, really interesting. It's a book that looks at the importance of the violin within the Jewish community, and then it is looking at how this instrument and the music it produces became this sort of symbol of hope during the Holocaust. It's looking at the musicians, it's looking at people who were just impacted by the music, and it's looking at it through the lens of true life stories. And so for anyone who's interested in music, who wants to learn more about the Holocaust, like, this was really, really good. I really enjoyed it. I want to say that I might have read this for, it was either Nonfiction November or the History Challenge last year, one of the two, but I did really enjoy it. And as someone who grew up with a father who is a musician and loves music, it was fascinating to look at it from this like historical vantage point, because I didn't know much about the impact of violins on the Jewish community or any of these stories that they told about the musicians. So this is the sort of like World War II Holocaust story that I'm really drawn to. Something that is through a different lens and really illuminates aspects of the history that I haven't previously seen. So that was a success in that way. And then the last book for this unhaul is a book that I nearly unhauled last time, and I had reservations about it, and so I put it back on the shelf. But I told myself at the time, if you don't read it by the next time you're unhauling books, it has to go. Like, it has to, because you've had it for years, you've never picked it up, you've never put it on a TBR, and it's probably just not for you at this point. And that is The Meaning of Night by Michael Cox. And this is why I have held on to the book for this long. After killing the red-haired man, I took myself off to Quinn's for an oyster dinner. So begins the story of Edward Guivere, book lover, scholar, and murderer. So we have a murderer as the main character here. Fascinating, because usually you're hunting down the murderer. So this feels like it's gonna have like anti-hero sort of vibes, which appeals to me. It's also set like in Victorian something. Yes, I think it's set in Victorian England. So a lot of like buzzwords for me here. But like I said, I've had it for years and have just never picked it up. And it's also really heavy. What? How? This is a ridiculously heavy paperback for no apparent reason. Because it's definitely, I mean, it's thick. Okay, I guess it's nearly 700 pages. So that might be why it's heavy. But I have to be really invested in a story to want to read something of this length as much as I enjoy big books. Like, you know, I love them, love to see it, but nearly 700 pages, have had it for years, I'm never drawn to it, it's just gotta go at this point. So yeah, those are the books that I am getting rid of this time around. As I mentioned at the very beginning of this thing, these books I will first let my family sort through them, see if there's anything that appeals to them, and the rest will be donated to the secondhand bookstore to raise money for our local library. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, be sure to give it a thumbs up, comment, and subscribe. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye!